Well, tonight, I want to talk about something kind of chill. I want to talk about what it means to be human. What it means to struggle with the finite nature of our existence. I want to talk about the existential crisis of aging, the kind of self-assurance that it takes to acknowledge and be at peace with the loss of our capacities, the strength that it takes to let go of roles that defined our identities. This is a sermon about letting go of the projects that we have invested our time, money, and energy in, but that ultimately might not be ours to finish. This is a sermon about the sacred task of cultivating humility so that we might come to terms with all these truths whenever we encounter them in our lives. And I want to talk about all of this week because this week we watched a leader of a nation wrestle with these questions and ultimately come to terms with the idea that his time in power was over. And that to ensure the continuation of the sacred project, it was time to pass the torch to the next generation. I'm, of course, talking about Moses. Talking about Moses. In this week's Torah portion, our Torah portion, Pinchas, it's this week, this is crazy, right? That Moses, knowing that he will die before he enters the promised land, appoints Joshua to be his successor, as student Rabbi Deborah Bell mentioned earlier. It's amazing that this happens to be the Torah portion that we read this week. The center of the Jewish nerd and political junkie Venn diagram, of which I am prominently in the center, are a bit beside ourselves. It's amazing that this happens to be the Torah portion the exact week that, for the first time in American history, a sitting president decided to end his campaign for re-election and endorsed his vice president to lead the ticket. I want to be clear also about what this sermon is not. This sermon is not a sermon about politics. Many of us here probably have vastly different interpretations of the events of this past week, and there are many important questions about what happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it could have happened differently, all of which are fair questions to ask. And I don't want us to dwell in those questions right now, but rather I want to lift up and highlight the parallel nature of what is happening in our news cycle and the story we encounter in our Torah portion. Because the fact that it exists in both our ancient text and on Twitter speaks to the fundamental aspects of human nature, to the humanness of not only of Moses and President Biden, but of each and every one of us. What both of their decisions demonstrate is the tension between ego, ambition, self-preservation, and identity on one end, and coming to terms with the limits of our abilities, and being willing to let go of parts of ourselves to pass the torch to the next generation. So let's talk about Moses. I think it's pretty clear that Moses made the right decision to ask God to appoint a successor. He wanted to ensure that the Israelites would not have to endure the panic and anxiety of being without a clear leader, of not knowing what would happen after he died. He ensured peace of mind and stability as they inched closer and closer to the promised land. But this was not an easy decision for Moses, and it makes sense why. At his core, Moses was the leader of the Israelites. His identity was inextricably tied up in that role. So much so that there are rabbinic imaginings that Moses sometimes neglected his wife and family in the name of serving his people. Over and over again in our text, we see moments where he stretches himself too much, where he doesn't leave enough space for others or even really for himself. He had sacrificed so much and endured many hardships and dealt with endless kvetching from the Israelites in order to reach that moment. And while at this point in the story he was aware that he would not enter the promised land, I imagine that the act of appointing a successor made it real. It brought it from the theoretical to the real world. And our text leaves a few hints of his hesitations. We read, Moses says to God, "Let Adonai, source of the breath of all flesh, appoint someone over the community, who shall go out before them and come in before them, and who shall take them out and bring them in, so that Adonai's community may not be like sheep that have no shepherd." First, the phrase, "a sheep that has no shepherd," suggests that Moses still sees himself in the role of leader of the Israelites, even though he's asking for a successor. I can't believe that the choice of metaphor, a shepherd with a flock of sheep, was accidental. Moses was, after all, first a shepherd before God called to him from the burning bush. He still struggles to see anyone else in that role beside himself. Second, and this is one for the real Torah nerds out there, this is the only place in the Torah in which we read, "Vayidaber Moshe el Adonai lemor." Moses spoke to Adonai, saying. We usually read, "Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor." Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, right? God usually speaks to Moses, not the other way around. And he speaks to Moses and he speaks to God, and asks God to identify a successor for him. He doesn't pick Joshua himself. On the one hand, this can be interpreted as necessary for legitimacy. A divine appointment would ensure a peaceful transfer of power. It can also be interpreted as Moses' deep humility and understanding that it is only God who can pick a successor. And in fact, Moses is actually taking initiative to usher in this change by urging God to act now. But the way I read it is a little bit different. I also think Moses asking God to pick the successor reveals some hesitation. It reflects how existentially difficult it was to let go of power, to admit to himself that his reign had ended and that it was time for a changing of the guard. He couldn't bring himself to be the one to lead the search. It was perhaps less painful for him to delegate this task to God on his behalf. He kind of closed his eyes and said, God, you pick. I can't do it. All of this is to say that if Moses, a man singled out by God to lead the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, a man who literally encountered God face to face, a man who is perennially characterized by his abundant empathy and profound leadership, if even he struggled to loosen his grip and let someone else lead, how much more so must that be true for each and every one of us? It is no simple task to set our egos and our ambitions aside. We sometimes imagine that our workplaces wouldn't be able to function without us, that our ex simply wouldn't be able to go on without us in their lives, that the world will stop spinning when our time here on this earth has come to an end. But that kind of thinking only ensures that we delude ourselves into believing that we are the center of the universe, that our goals, dreams, and desires are the only thing of value in the world. And when we allow those thoughts to permeate, everyone suffers. The world becomes stagnant and stale, a time capsule of what was rather than a vision of what could be. We don't allow ourselves to stop and reflect, to look back on what we have accomplished and enjoy all that we have created and built in our lifetimes. The antidote is cultivating humility and self-awareness, recognizing our innate humanness, that our lives are finite, that what we create, the lives we touch, that is what lives on, not us. That we can't be in control forever, we can't be here forever. We need to recognize when our ambition has clouded our judgment, when our need to feel important overshadows the needs of others. Now, certainly no one in this room has sat at the helm of power like Moses or President Biden, but we all have had those moments when we put the desires of our egos above the greater good of the organizations we work for, above the good of our family and friends, above the good of our own health and well-being. Like Moses, we all need those people in our lives that remind us of our fragile humanity, who, with empathetic candor, hold a mirror up to us so that we might see ourselves as we really are, and see our abilities as they really are, and as they continue to change. Who helps us see beyond our own personal desires to what is best for the greater good. Jewish tradition itself also serves as this reminder, not just in Torah portions like the one we read this week, but throughout many of our holidays and traditions. In fact, the entire arc of the high holidays, I said the word high holidays, but the entire arc of the high holidays serves this purpose, pushing us to take stock of who we have been, who we want to be, and reminding us that our time here is finite. On Yom Kippur, every single Jew confronts our mortality. Whether we are in the highest echelons of power or the lowest, we all stand side by side together, coming face to face with the reality of human existence. May we all take a good, honest look inward and consider, what are the spaces in our lives where it is time to pass the baton? What are we gripping a little too tightly to, and why? What have we been working on that might not actually be ours to finish? What do we want our legacy, our impact in this world to be? And what do we need to change to make that a reality? It is human nature to want to feel important, to want to feel needed. But there is a profound beauty in letting ourselves step into the background, not only to ensure a healthier future for all, but to create space for peace and wholeness in our own hearts. In George Washington's farewell address, an address that centered on his historic decision to step away from power even when the nation begged him to stay, he quoted a text from the Hebrew Bible, from the book of Micah. It was one of his favorites. He quoted it many, many times. Everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. A vision of the peace, comfort, and satisfaction of a life well lived and of a life that has come to a rest. May we all engage deeply in cultivating a practice of humility, that we might leave this world having changed it and the people we interacted with for the better. Through that endeavor, may we find the peace and tranquility of sitting beneath our own vines and fig trees. Shabbat Shalom.